Hey everybody. So in this video we're going to take a look at how to use those comparisons we talked about in the last video. And we're going to use something called a selection structure. So that's kind of just a fancy word for an if statement in programming. Okay. So what we want to have happen is we want the computer to be able to make a decision based on something that's going on in our code. Right? So we can choose to execute a certain section of code, or we could choose not to execute that certain section of code based on some type of comparison of data that's going on in our program. And the syntax is pretty straightforward for an if statement. So you just say if, and you would have a comparison, right? Whatever, so like a equals b, or is x equal to 2, or whatever it is that you need it to be. And then you put a colon. And then any code you want to have happen if that comparison is true would be indented from your regular left-hand margin. Okay, and that indent means that it's part of the if statement. It doesn't actually matter how much it's indented. You just have to be consistent with how you've indented for that particular if statement. Okay, so I mean something very straightforward would be, say if x equals to 2, so there's your comparison, and then you'd have, say, one or more statements inside here, so print hello. Okay. So if this program was executing, this would only print if that comparison actually evaluated to true. And I mean, it kind of just logically makes sense to write something like that. You can read a piece of code and it just makes sense, right? So if something is true, then do something else. If it's not true, skip it. So maybe we'll spend the rest of the video just kind of going through just a few different examples of how this kind of works and what you might see when you're doing it. Okay? So the first little program we'll write is just maybe just kind of a test this type of idea out. So let's say you have a variable a, it's entered from the keyboard. Okay? So let's do like a favorite number type of program here. So we'll say enter your we'll just say enter a number. Okay, as an integer. And let's say if a equals 7, then that's my favorite number. Okay. So we'll print you entered my favorite number. Okay. And it will say if a equals 4, then that's my least favorite number. Okay. And then we'll just watch what happens when this code executes. So if we run it, okay, and I enter an input of 7, okay, so it says you entered my favorite number. So just remember the logic of your program. It goes from top to bottom, right? It will execute every command that it's able to execute. So it gets the value 7 from the keyboard, stores it in A. Now it does this comparison. Is A equal to 7? All right, the answer to that is true. So it will print this. Right? Anything indented, it would print. Now it continues on after your if statement, and now it does this if statement. So is a equals to 7? Is a equal to 4? That answer is no. Okay, so it will completely skip this block of code, and then the program ends after that. Right? And then the same would be true if I entered 4. Okay, so it says you've entered my least favorite number. So this block of code in here is skipped because this comparison is false. And if I entered even something totally different like 12, okay, well then nothing gets printed because this comparison is false, so skip that. All right, this comparison is false, so we'll skip that as well, and then my program ends. So any of the types of comparisons you say would have used in the previous part of the lesson, you can use in an if statement as well. So even some of those like compound comparisons. So let's say we've got two numbers that I'm going to get from the keyboard here. So, and we'll just try some of those out. Oops. Okay. And I don't know, let's say we do say like if y is greater than 3 or x is less than or equal to 6. Okay. and I almost always forget this colon here when I do my if statements, so please excuse me if I do that when I'm typing. So I'm coming from, I learned my first programming language was C and then Java, and that doesn't use it, it uses the curly braces instead. So you'll often see me generate an error over here when I forget that. So something you're just going to need to get used to. Okay, and I don't know, let's print favorite expression, winner, winner, chicken dinner. Okay, and then we will print end here at the end. All right, and if we kind of test this program out with some different inputs, so maybe we enter like 5 and 1. Okay, so you should be able to predict now whether that program is going to, whether that print statement is going to execute or not. So is y bigger than 3? No, so that's a false. Is x less than or equal to 6? And that is a true. So this should probably print winner, winner, chicken dinner, and then it will print end after that, because an or statement only needs one of those comparisons to be false. So I hit enter, yeah, and winner, winner, chicken dinner, okay, and end. And if I were to change kind of the input around, so if I entered, say 8 and 1, right, then I'm still going to get a false for the comparison there, but and I'm going to get a false for the comparison here. So a false or a false is going to give me a false. So it's going to skip this part of the if statement and just print the word end onto the screen, like we would expect it to do. Okay, so anything you learned in the last video is still learning. It's just now we're using it to have some code execute. And maybe for another example, let's take a look at, again, we'll just kind of keep to entering a number here. Use A in this example instead. But let's print out just a message that says if the number that gets entered from the keyboard is bigger than 100, we will print out, say, wow, that's a big number. Or if it's less than 100, then we'll print out, oh, that's not a big number. I like kind of to do this program. We can do this using 2 if statements. In the next video, we'll talk about how to maybe do this a little bit better, because there's kind of a different type of structure that we can use that is a little more popular and probably a bit better to use in this particular example. But okay, so we're going to enter a number. So we'll say if A is bigger than or equal to 100, then we'll print, okay, so wow, that's a big number. Okay. And if A is less than 100, we can print, oh, that is not a big number. Okay. All right, so if it's bigger than 100, we're printing this. If it's less than 100, we're printing that. Now, I guess the one kind of thing you do have to keep in mind is you would, in this scenario, you would not want both of these to execute at the same time. So you would have to watch your greater than and equal to, or your less than or equal to, and make sure they're not they don't have equal to in both, right? So in this case, I chose to have the equals with the bigger than 100. So, right, if it's actually equal to 100, it's still going to print, wow, that's a big number. But if I did something like this, then that's not going to give you what expected, because if I enter the number 100, now it prints both, right? So be cognizant of that when you're creating a set of either or structures, okay? And that's what this is, and that's kind of a common thing that we would do. So if something is true, do a certain piece of code. If it's not true, do a different piece of code. And there's something called an if-else structure that we'll get to in the next video. That's kind of a better way to do that. But if you're just going to use if statements, then be aware you would, if you're looking for an either-or scenario, then make sure you get your comparisons correct in that sense. And maybe we'll finish off with just kind of one maybe more practical example for using this statement. So let's say you want to write a program that lets you save the tax on a purchase if you buy at least 5 of a certain item. Okay, that's kind of a common thing that might happen. The more you buy, the more you save. Right? So in order to do that, let's say we need we need the number of items from the user. So enter how many items. Maybe we'll need the cost too. Cost of item. That's probably a floating point value. So how much does it cost? Okay. And what I want my program to do is to print out the kind of a statement that would say whether you have to pay tax on that, and then the total cost, and or say no, you don't have to pay that, and print out the total cost of that as well. Okay. And I think I said what if you buy more than 5 items, there's no tax. If you buy less than 5 items, then there would be tax. So if num items is less than 5, so there's we'll be paying tax on this. So we'll print you will have to pay tax. Okay. And then I can also calculate the total inside of that. Okay. So you can have more than one statement inside the if, as many as you want. Okay. So the total in this case, what? So we need the number of items times the cost of an item. That'll give me the subtotal, and then times by 1.13, because I'm assuming a 13% tax. All right, that'll give me the total. And if my num items is bigger than or equal to 5, I'm not going to pay tax. And I'll print no tax on that. And I'll calculate the total. So I don't need brackets. So num items times cost of item. I suppose I probably could have done this calculation in a different way too. I'll show you that in a minute maybe. Okay. And then I could print down here. Oops. Okay. So your items cost, so whatever they happen to cost. So, and it's a dollar figure, so maybe we'll print it out nicely. All right. So round total to 2 decimal spots. Okay. So I don't know how many items. I'm going to say, let's say 10 items, so that's bigger than 5. How much does it cost? Let's say $5. So our cost is $50 because I'm not paying tax on that. That makes sense. 5 times 10. Okay. So let's say I'm paying 2 items, and they're $50 each. Okay. So that's a total of 100 times 13%, which is $113, and that also makes sense. Okay. So I guess one thing, I chose to do the print statement down here. Okay. I could have done it inside each if statement. Okay. There would be really nothing wrong with that. It's not as efficient. You're writing more code than you need to do because this is always getting executed. So really, why would you bother putting it in the if statement? You could just have it execute at the end of your program. I think that makes a little more sense. And kind of what I thought about as well as I was kind of writing this. This calculation is going to be done regardless anyways, right? So that could be moved out of the if statement as well. So perhaps a little more efficient way to do this is you could have calculated the total up here. So num items times the cost of the item. Okay. And instead of doing this, I could just say total times 1.13, and then here I wouldn't need to write anything, right? Because my total is already going to be that num items times cost of items. So I could just use my if statement to print, and then it would still, the code logic would still be the same. I spelled total wrong there. Okay. So I mean, sometimes there's a lot of different ways that you could use these if statements to solve your problem. I'm not really picky on what you're doing, but if you can make it a little more efficient with a little less code, then I think that just makes good sense to do sometimes.